She kept her 6-month-old son a secret from his millionaire dad. Now, I need to ask for just a little bit of help from you. If you're enjoying the stories, if they resonate with you, or if they bring a little light to your day, please consider showing your support. Like, comment, and subscribe. Every little gesture goes a long way in helping us grow and continue bringing you more of these meaningful stories. Your support truly means the world to me. And of course, don't forget to watch the story until the very end today. Trust me, it's one that's going to stay with you. You won't want to miss how it unfolds. Thanks again for being. Zariah Monet sat in her family's living room, her fingers trembling slightly as she fidgeted with the edge of her silk blouse. The soft sound of jazz from a distant record player barely filled the room, as the silence between her and her parents, Daniel and Loretta Monet, grew thick and uncomfortable. Zariah's heart was heavy with dread, her mind racing in 1,000 different directions. She was being asked to marry Lucian Vale, a man she didn't know, a man whose wealth and status were so far beyond her reach they might as well have existed in another universe. She looked at her parents, trying to understand, but all she saw in their eyes was a silent plea, one that she knew she couldn't ignore, no matter how much she wanted to. Her father, Daniel, cleared his throat and spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had made decisions before her birth, decisions that would now shape her future. "Zariah," he began, his words slow, deliberate. "This isn't just a marriage, it's an alliance, a stepping stone for our family." His eyes were filled with a blend of resignation and hope, but to Zariah it felt like a sentence. "Lucian Vale has power, influence, and connections. His name opens doors, doors that could change everything for us." Zariah's stomach twisted. "But what about me?" she asked, her voice tight, the words coming out in a breathless whisper. "What about what I want? Who is he to me?" "He's just a stranger." Her chest ached with a hollow emptiness, but she tried to hold her ground. Her mother, Loretta, placed a hand gently on her arm, her touch soft but firm. "Lucian Vale is more than just a man, Zariah. He's a symbol. He's everything your father has worked for. And we don't get to choose our battles, sweetheart. Sometimes we make sacrifices for the greater good." There was a bitterness in her mother's voice that Zariah hadn't heard before. But it didn't matter. She couldn't bear to hear it now. The weight of her parents' decisions pressed down on her, suffocating her in a way that felt worse than the cruelest rejection. "No," Zariah whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't right. You're asking me to marry him for his money, for his name. What about love, Papa? What about the man I deserve?" Her father's face softened for a moment, the sorrow evident in his eyes, but his voice remained unyielding. "Love doesn't matter, Zariah. This is about survival. Love doesn't open doors the way money and status can. You have to understand. This marriage is a business. It's about securing our future." She stood abruptly, her hands balling into fists at her sides. She could feel the anger rising within her like a tidal wave. "So, I'm just a pawn in your game," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You don't even care what happens to me, do you? This is just about your image, your legacy." Her father's expression hardened. "This is not about us, Zariah. This is about securing your future. You're not thinking long-term. We've worked too hard to let everything slip away now." But Zariah's heart was already heavy with the burden of their expectations, and she knew she had no choice but to comply. Her dreams of love, of a man who would cherish her, were fading, slipping away like sand between her fingers. The idea of marrying Lucien Vale felt like a cruel joke, and yet it was the only reality she had left. The next day, Zariah stood at the altar, her wedding dress heavy around her, and her heart heavier still. Lucien Vale, the man she was now supposed to call her husband, stood before her, a cold, calculating expression on his face as he exchanged perfunctory vows with her. The cameras flashed, the guests smiled, but Zariah could feel nothing but the hollow ache in her chest. Lucien's eyes avoided hers, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was invisible to him, that she was nothing more than a piece of his collection, a trophy to be displayed in front of society. When the pastor asked Lucien if he took her as his wife, the words came easily to him, his voice smooth and indifferent. "I do." And when it was her turn, Zariah barely managed to speak. "I do." The words left her lips like a lie, but what other choice did she have? She was trapped in a marriage that wasn't her own, bound by promises she never made. The night of their wedding, Zariah sat alone in the grand, empty mansion that had become her prison. Lucien had barely acknowledged her presence since they exchanged vows, too busy with his own thoughts to care. She sat on the edge of their massive bed, the soft satin of her dress clinging to her skin like a second layer of grief. She tried to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest, the ache of knowing she would never be enough for him. But the tears came anyway. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Lucien didn't love her, and he never would. She wasn't the woman he wanted. She was just a symbol, a political move. The woman he truly desired was someone who fit into his world. Effortlessly, someone who reflected his idea of perfection. He had made that clear since the moment they met. In the days that followed, Zariah tried to convince herself that she could make this work. After all, this was her life now. She had no choice but to adapt, to fit into a world that wasn't hers. Lucien continued to ignore her, his attention always elsewhere, on business, on his parents, on everything except her. He had made it clear in subtle ways that he was only tolerating her presence. He never touched her, never looked at her the way a husband should. He treated her like a shadow, something that existed only to serve his image. One evening, a few weeks after their marriage, Zariah accompanied Lucien to a public event, a charity gala meant to show the Vale family's wealth and influence. She stood beside him, a silent figure in the background, her beauty and presence unnoticed by most. But then, in the middle of the night, Lucien arrived with a stunning woman on his arm, Celeste Thornwell, an old friend, someone who fit perfectly into his world. Zariah watched as they laughed, as they exchanged inside jokes, as if she wasn't even there. It was a painful reminder that Lucien didn't see her, not as a wife, not as a person. She was simply an accessory, an object to display. Later that night, Zariah retreated to the balcony, the cold air biting her skin as she tried to gather her thoughts. She had always known that this marriage wasn't about love, but the reality of it still hit her like a punch to the gut. The tears welled up in her eyes again, but she refused to let them fall. She had been trained to be strong, to endure the weight of her family's expectations. She wasn't going to let Lucien or anyone else see her weakness. She wasn't going to let them win. But as she stared out at the sprawling city lights below, the loneliness consumed her, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely, utterly invisible. Zariah closed her eyes and whispered to the night, "I don't know if I can do this anymore." Zariah sat on the edge of the grand marble staircase, her fingers trailing over the smooth, cold banister. The Vale estate loomed before her, massive, cold and sterile. It was a home, yet it felt more like a museum, meticulously curated to reflect wealth, but completely devoid of warmth. The house was a reflection of Lucien's world, imposing, perfect, and emotionally barren. Each step she took felt like a step further away from the woman she once was, the woman who had dreams of a home filled with laughter, love, and warmth. Here, all she had was silence. When Zariah had first stepped through the front doors of the Vale estate, she had been awestruck by its opulence. The chandeliers sparkled like diamonds, casting their light across the polished floors, and the walls were adorned with priceless works of art. Every room was a testament to Lucien's wealth, but there was no soul, no vibrancy. The house felt dead, as if the luxury was a shield, a facade hiding the emptiness within. She had expected to feel like a queen in a palace, but instead she felt like a prisoner in a gilded cage. Days blurred into one another. Zariah wandered through the halls of the mansion, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Lucien barely spoke to her, his presence fleeting, his attention always elsewhere. He was consumed by his business, his family, and his own world. When he did speak to her, it was either in short, dismissive sentences or in a tone that lacked warmth, like a man talking to a stranger. He never looked at her like a wife. He never looked at her like a woman. She was just another fixture in his life, something to be tolerated, not cherished. One afternoon, Zariah found herself standing in front of a full-length mirror in the bedroom, studying her reflection. The soft glow of the afternoon sun filtered through the large windows, casting a warm light on her skin, but it did nothing to warm the chill that had settled in her heart. She had tried to adapt to this new life, to this new world. She had tried to put on the mask of a wife, to smile when she needed to stand beside Lucien at public events and dinners. But it was hard. Every smile felt forced, every conversation felt empty. She could feel herself withering under the weight of loneliness. The mansion, with all its grandeur, only highlighted the vast emptiness she felt inside. Every room was designed to impress, to make a statement. But none of them felt like a home. There were no personal touches, no warmth, just cold, expensive furniture and untouched spaces that no one truly lived in. Zariah felt like a ghost in her own home, drifting from room to room, searching for a place where she might feel like she belonged. At dinner, Lucien sat at the head of the table, his attention entirely focused on his phone, scrolling through emails. Zariah sat across from him, the silence between them as heavy as the crystal chandelier hanging above them. She had, grown used to it by now, the absence of conversation. He never asked about her day, never inquired about her thoughts or feelings. It was as though she didn't exist beyond the role she was expected to play. A wife, a trophy, a symbol, but never a person. "Lucien," Zariah finally spoke, her voice a soft whisper in the vast, empty space between them. Lucien didn't look up. He replied, his voice absent, distracted. "Do you even remember our wedding day?" she asked, her heart aching as she stared at his blank face. Lucien's fingers paused on his phone, and for a moment she thought he might respond with something real, something human. But then he simply muttered, "I remember it was a long day. A lot of photos." Zariah blinked, her throat tightening. "Is that all it was to you?" she whispered. But he didn't answer. Instead, he picked up his wine glass and took a long sip, the sound of the glass touching his lips, the only thing breaking the silence. Days passed, and the silence between them deepened. Zariah spent most of her time wandering through the estate, trying to fill the void that stretched out in every direction. She visited the garden, with its perfectly manicured flowers and trees that had never seen the warmth of her touch. She walked along the long hallways, admiring the expensive art, the gleaming marble floors, the endless display of wealth. But none of it mattered. None of it brought her peace. One afternoon, she wandered into the library, hoping to find something that might distract her from the emptiness. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, each one more impressive than the last. There were books on business, politics, art, and culture, everything Lucien valued. But there were no novels, no stories, no poetry. There was nothing here to soothe her aching soul. She pulled a book from the shelf, a thick leather-bound tome, and opened it to a random page. But before she could read a single word, her eyes filled with tears. The weight of her isolation, the endless nights in this mansion, had become too much. She had come here full of hope, full of dreams for the future. But now all she could see was the coldness of the life she had been forced into. She closed the book and sat on the floor, her back against the shelf, letting the tears fall freely. Lucien continued his life as if she didn't exist. He attended meetings, traveled for business, and spent his evenings with friends or at galas. Zariah was left behind, a mere decoration in his life. When he was home, he barely looked at her. His life was full of noise, of people, of events, but there was no room for her in it. The house, once filled with the promise of a new beginning, now felt like a tomb. Zariah had tried to make the best of it, to find some semblance of peace in her new life. But the more she tried, the more she felt like an outsider on her own home. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the estate in a soft, golden light, Zariah stood by the window, staring out at the sprawling gardens. She was alone, as always. Lucien was off at another business dinner, and she had nothing to do but wait for his return. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on her, suffocating her. She could feel her heart withering, piece by piece, under the constant pressure of his indifference. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the emptiness. She could hear the sound of the wind rustling the leaves outside, the distant chirping of the crickets, the soft hum of the air conditioning in the background. But all she could focus on was the emptiness inside her, a vast, aching void that no amount of luxury or wealth could fill. She had everything, and yet she had nothing. The loneliness was unbearable, but Zariah held on to her dignity. She couldn't let herself fall apart, not yet, not when there was still a flicker of hope inside her. She didn't know what that hope was, or where it would lead, but she refused to let the coldness of Lucien's world completely consume her. She would find a way to survive this, if only for herself. Zariah's heart raced as she sat on the edge of the polished marble countertop, the weight of the moment settling around her like an inescapable fog. The grand mansion she had hoped would one day feel like home had now become a place of unbearable isolation. Every step she took seemed to echo with the distance between herself and Lucien, a gap that had only widened with time. The silence in their marriage had grown so suffocating that she no longer knew who she was. Was she a wife? A stranger? A ghost? She had hoped, against all odds, that things might change, that the man she had married, the one who had once looked at her with something resembling affection, might see her as more than a symbol. But now, even hope felt like a distant memory. Lucien's footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Zariah's stomach tightened in anticipation. She had been expecting him to come home, but not like this. Not with the cold, detached energy that had begun to settle around him. He entered the kitchen without a word, his presence filling the room with the same oppressive silence that had come to define their days together. His dark eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, now held something different, something colder, emptier. His jaw was set, his posture rigid. Zariah's breath caught in her throat as she waited for him to speak. "Zariah," Lucien began, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "I want a divorce." The words hit her like a slap in the face. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. Divorce? She felt the blood drain from her face, her vision blurring for a brief second. She blinked rapidly, trying to steady herself, but the shock of his words left her numb. She had expected a lot from this marriage: indifference, coldness, even cruelty. But not this. Not this sudden, heartless declaration. "What?" she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Lucien looked at her with an almost clinical detachment, as if he were discussing a business transaction, not the fate of their marriage. "I want out. I'm marrying Celeste Thornwell." The name struck her like a dagger. Celeste Thornwell, the woman Lucien had always idolized. She was everything Zariah was not: white, blonde, young, and beautiful, the epitome of everything Lucien had been taught to value. The woman who fit perfectly into his world, who could give him the image he craved. A woman who would never remind him of the uncomfortable reality of a forced marriage. A reality he had tried so desperately to ignore. Zariah's chest tightened, the words clawing at her heart. She could feel the bitter taste of rejection rising in her throat. "Celeste?" she asked, barely able to speak through the lump in her throat. "You're leaving me for her?" Lucien's eyes flickered with something that almost resembled impatience, but he quickly masked it, his tone cold. "I've already made up my mind, Zariah. Celeste is everything I want. She's beautiful. She fits my life. You're just a mistake. A way to appease my parents. You were never the one I wanted. I thought I could make it work, but I can't. I'm done." Her heart shattered in that instant, but she didn't let it show. She had learned over the months to keep her emotions hidden, to hide the pain behind the mask of composure she had perfected. She had become so good at it that even now, with her world crumbling around her, she stood tall, refusing to crumble before him. "So, this is it?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Just like that, you're throwing me away." Lucien didn't respond, his face unreadable. The words hung in the air, cutting deeper than anything he could have said. Zariah stood frozen, her mind spinning, but she couldn't bring herself to move, to speak any more. The reality of his rejection was overwhelming, suffocating. The years of empty promises, the silent dinners, the nights alone in the same bed. It had all been leading to this. She had never been enough for him. She would never be enough. He had used her, married her out of obligation, and now, when he had found a prettier, younger woman, he was discarding her like a piece of trash. Zariah turned away, her throat constricting with emotion. "Fine," she said, her voice cold and distant, more to herself than to him. You want a divorce? Then have it. I'm done. She didn't care about the wealth, the mansion, or any of it. None of it mattered any more. He didn't matter. Her heart was already breaking into pieces, but she refused to let him see her cry. Not now. Not ever. She walked out of the kitchen, her footsteps steady, though the weight of his words threatened to crush her with every step. She moved through the mansion like a ghost, the walls closing in on her as the reality of his indifference settled in her bones. The grand staircase, the empty rooms, and the silence. It all felt so final now. There was no more pretending, no more hopes of rekindling anything. Lucien was gone, and so was her place in this world. She packed her things in a daze, the movements mechanical. As she gathered her few belongings, she kept her mind focused on the task at hand, refusing to let herself dwell on the pain of what was happening. It wasn't until she was standing in the foyer, suitcases packed, her hand resting on the cold doorknob, that the tears finally came. They came in silent waves, crashing over her, making her knees weaken as she tried to hold herself upright. She had never been one to cry. She had learned long ago to be strong. But now, with the door between her and the life she had tried so hard to build with him, the floodgates opened. But then, through the haze of her tears, a strange feeling washed over her, one that felt far deeper than heartbreak. It was a sensation of something new, something entirely unexpected. A pulse, a tiny flutter deep inside her, an echo of life where there had only been pain. Zariah froze, her hand pressed against her stomach, the weight of the sensation making her feel dizzy. She was no doctor, but something told her, something deep within her, that this wasn't just the aftermath of her broken heart. It was something more, something far more profound. Lucien was already in the process of moving forward with his plans, his focus entirely on Celeste, the woman he had always longed for. He didn't look back, not even once. He had made his decision, and Zariah was nothing more than a forgotten chapter in his life. Zariah left the estate that night, her heart shattered, her spirit bruised. But there was something else within her, something fragile, something new. Unbeknownst to Lucien, as he moved on with his life, Zariah was carrying a secret he would never know. The very thing he had discarded, the very thing he had thrown away, was growing inside her. The air outside was crisp as autumn began to settle in, the golden hues of the setting sun casting a soft glow over the world. Zariah sat on the edge of her modest apartment's bed, her hands trembling as she stared at the small plastic test in her palm. The two pink lines seemed to glow in the dim light, a stark contrast to the emptiness that had settled in her heart over the past week. It felt like everything she had known had shattered. And yet here, in the midst of the wreckage, something new had emerged, something fragile, something undeniable. She blinked a few times, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. Pregnant. She was pregnant. The words swirled in her mind, unable to take root at first. But as she looked at the test again, she knew. She knew this wasn't just a momentary lapse in reality. This wasn't just some cruel joke. It was real. A new life was growing inside of her. Her fingers gripped the edge of the test harder, as if she could somehow keep this truth from breaking free. She had only been with Lucien a few short days before their divorce, but it was enough. He had been so distant, so cold, that she had never even thought about the possibility of carrying his child. Yet now, The truth of it filled her entire being. A child, a tiny seed of life, had taken root within her. The gravity of the situation settled over her like a weight. Her mind raced with 1,000 emotions: shock, disbelief, and even an overwhelming sense of protectiveness. Zariah closed her eyes, fighting back tears. The pain of her divorce, the rejection, the abandonment, all of it had felt like the end. But now she was faced with a new beginning. She was alone, yes, but she was not without purpose. She had a reason to keep going. She had a reason to be strong. The next few hours were a blur as she sat in the small, sparse living room of the apartment, her mind unraveling. She thought of Lucien, of the man who had so easily discarded her, and she felt an overwhelming pang of sorrow. He would never know about this child. He would never be a father. She would never allow it. Not when he had thrown her away, like she was nothing more than a piece of property. He had never loved her. He had never truly seen her. What was there to make him care about a child he had never wanted? Zariah's eyes burned with the weight of that realization. But there was something else there too. Something stronger than sorrow. It was resolve. She would not let her child grow up in the shadow of Lucien's indifference. She would protect her child from the legacy of lovelessness that had been thrust upon her. This child would know love. This child would be cherished, even if she had to do it alone. For the first time since her life had been turned upside down, Zariah felt a flicker of hope. Her heart, once broken beyond repair, now beat with a new purpose. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The decision to keep the child was not an easy one. She could have reached out to Lucien, forced him to face the truth, made him take responsibility. But she knew better. Lucien would never change. He would never become the man she needed him to be, the man this child deserved. She would never let him near this precious life that had begun to grow inside her. She was determined to protect it, to shield it from a world that had already proven to be harsh and unforgiving. Zariah's hand moved to her stomach, her fingertips lightly brushing against the small swell of her abdomen, as though she could already sense the life growing within her. She smiled faintly, the corners of her lips lifting for the first time in days. The room around her was still, the silence broken only by the sound of her steady breathing. She thought of the life she would give this child. It would not be one of luxury or wealth, but it would be filled with love. It would be filled with warmth, even if that warmth had to come from within her. She would be the one to teach her child the value of kindness, of strength, of resilience. Her child would never know the coldness that Lucien had shown her. The child would not grow up in the shadow of a man who valued status over family, who discarded those he didn't deem worthy. Zariah wiped her eyes, clearing away the last of the tears, and stood up. There was work to be done. She had a life to protect now, a life that depended on her to be strong, to be steady. She wouldn't fail this child, not when it had already become her greatest treasure. She would take care of herself. She would take care of the baby. As she walked into the small kitchen to pour herself a glass of water, her hand brushed against the countertop, her mind racing with what was to come. She didn't know how she would manage. She didn't know what the future held. All she knew was that she was no longer afraid. This was not the end. This was only the beginning. She might have been thrown away by Lucien, but she was not broken. She was not defeated. She had something to fight for now, and she would do whatever it took to give her child the life it deserved. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Zariah stepped outside onto the small balcony, the cool breeze brushing against her face. She took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp air, and closed her eyes. In that moment, everything felt still. Everything felt quiet. She felt connected to something bigger than herself, as though the universe had whispered to her that she was not alone, that there was a plan for her, a purpose she hadn't fully understood yet. She placed her hand on her belly once more, her heart swelling with a mix of love and determination. She would raise this child with everything she had. She would not allow the mistakes of the past to define their future. And as the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, Zariah made a promise to herself and to the life growing inside her. She would make sure this child would never know the same pain she had. She would be everything it needed, everything Lucian had failed to be. Her journey was far from over. It had only just begun. The sterile white walls of the delivery room seemed to blur in Zariah's vision, her body trembling from exhaustion, soaked in sweat and tears. The pain had been unimaginable, but through every contraction, through every breathless scream, she had one vision in her mind: her child, her son, her Kyle. Then came the cry, high, piercing, raw. It cut through the silence like light through darkness. Tears streamed down her cheeks as the nurse gently placed the tiny bundle on her chest. Zariah gasped, overwhelmed. He was so small, so perfect. His skin, a warm mahogany glow, was soft beneath her trembling fingertips. But what arrested her completely were his eyes, storm grey, wide open, already watchful, eyes she recognized immediately. Lucien's eyes. Her breath caught in her throat. A wave of complicated emotion crashed over her: awe, love, heartbreak, fear. Those eyes, once so cold on his father's face, now sparkled with innocence on her son's. But this boy, her Kale, was nothing like Lucien. He was her light, her reason. He was a second chance at life, and she would give him the world she never had. Zariah cradled him closer, inhaling the sweet, earthy scent of new life. Kale, she whispered, his name falling from her lips like a prayer. You are mine, my miracle. The following months passed in a blur of lullabies and midnight feedings, of whispered prayers and exhausted kisses on Kyle's forehead. Zariah's world shrank to a small circle: her son, her home, and her heart. But within that circle she discovered a peace she'd never known in Lucien's mansion of marble and glass. Her apartment was modest: 2 rooms, creaking floorboards, and drafty windows. But it was warm. The baby's laughter echoed through every corner like music, turning worn walls into walls of joy. She hung homemade mobiles over Kyle's crib, stitched tiny mittens when winter came, and turned second-hand furniture into a nursery fit for royalty. No diamonds, no chandeliers. But there was love in every corner, love that pulsed in every sigh and song and story she whispered to him at night. Zariah worked part-time at a local bookstore, her shifts carefully chosen so she could be home when Kyle woke up and when he went to sleep. Miss Denise, her elderly neighbor, offered to watch him while she worked. The old woman had grown fond of them quickly, calling Kale Little King and bringing him hand-knitted toys. Zariah would rush home every day, arms aching from carrying boxes and books, but her heart lightened the moment she opened the door and saw Kale's eyes lighting up, his hands reaching for her. His giggles were her salvation. His tiny voice, still learning to say "Mama," made every sacrifice worth it. There were nights when the memories crept in, nights when Cale had fallen asleep in her arms, and the quiet left room for thoughts to roam. She'd sit by the window and stare into the city lights, remembering Lucien. Not out of longing, but out of disbelief that someone so cold, so blind to love, had fathered a child so full of light. She would never understand it, but she had made peace with it. There was one evening, just after Kyle turned 6 months, when she stood before a mirror and truly looked at herself for the first time in a long time. Her body had changed, stronger in some places, softer in others. Her eyes had matured. She didn't see a woman who'd been discarded. She saw a mother who had survived. Zariah leaned over the crib, brushing a curl off Kyle's forehead as he slept. His chest rose and fell gently. Those silver-grey eyes, when closed, reminded her less of Lucien and more of a blank canvas, a future untainted. She smiled to herself. "You're not his shadow, baby," she whispered. "You're my light." There were no pearls around her neck, no designer gowns, no high society events. But in her small, quiet life, there was laughter, warmth, and safety. She cooked while Kyle babbled in his high chair, sang while folding his tiny clothes, and fell asleep each night to the rhythm of his breathing beside her. Love, she realized, didn't need to be extravagant. It just needed to be real. And she had built that reality for Kyle. One kiss, one lullaby, one quiet victory at a time. The golden arches of St. Belmont Cathedral gleamed under the sun, decked in ivory roses and crystal garlands. The wedding of Lucien Vale and Celeste Thornwell was a spectacle etched for headlines, an opulent affair attended by dignitaries, moguls, and the whispering elite. Cameras flashed, strings played, vows were exchanged. And yet, beneath the polished marble floor and behind the veil of luxury, the air between Lucien and Celeste was cold. Celeste was everything he had claimed to want, ethereal, alabaster-skinned, sharp-jawed with glassy blue eyes. Her family was old money, her lineage read like royalty. On paper, she completed his empire. But as she smiled beneath her veil, Lucien's eyes didn't soften, his hands didn't tremble. He repeated the vows as if reading from a boardroom script. The crowd clapped, champagne flowed. But inside, Lucien felt nothing. He had won, hadn't he? The mansion they moved into rivaled palaces, 10 bedrooms, chandeliers imported from Prague, heated marble floors, a wine cellar deeper than some subway lines. But its silence was sharp. Their conversations were limited to event calendars and investments. Celeste filled the halls with designer furniture, but never laughter. At night, she lay beside Lucien like porcelain, still, cold, perfect. And slowly, he began to notice the void. Something unspoken haunted their shared space. The emptiness echoed through the rooms. A year passed, then 2, and still, no child. They had agreed, early on, to begin a family quickly, to cement their image as the perfect couple, to carry the Vale name into a new era. But each month brought silence, and Celeste grew quieter. Her smiles became brittle, her eyes darker. Doctors were consulted. Tests were done in sterile clinics with sterile language. Lucien, ever the man of control, sat through each appointment like a CEO, reviewing quarterly losses, until the final one broke him. The doctor spoke calmly, but the words clawed at Lucien's ears like iron. "Mrs. Vale is medically infertile. She will not be able to conceive naturally. The probability is non-existent." The room tilted. Lucien didn't blink at first. He stared at the doctor, as if disbelief could rewind reality. Celeste sat beside him, her hands clenched in her lap, mascara smudged in the corners of her eyes. She didn't look at him. She hadn't looked at him in days. Lucien stood abruptly, leaving the clinic without a word. Rage bubbled within him, not at her, but at fate. At the godless design of a life that gave him everything, and yet nothing that mattered. The days that followed were a storm of silence. Celeste locked herself in her art studio. Lucien buried himself in work, adding zeros to an empire that now felt hollow. There were no children's footsteps in the hall, no lullabies, no nursery, just the echo of regret. Late at night, Lucien found himself standing in the West Wing, where he had commissioned a nursery long ago. It remained untouched. Dust had settled over tiny clothes folded neatly in drawers. A mobile of silver stars hung motionless over the empty crypt. He sat down in the rocker. And for the first time in years, he cried. Not because of Celeste, not even because of the child he would never have, but because of Zariah. He saw her face now in the quiet, the woman he had tossed aside like she was nothing, the woman whose eyes once begged him to see her, not as a political pawn, but as a person. She had wanted love, a family, a home. He gave her coldness, a cage, and now he sat in a palace of gold and glass, with no one left to smile for. His fists clenched in his lap. Lucien Vale, the man who could buy anything, was finally powerless. The afternoon sun filtered lazily through the tinted windows of the Vale Enterprises tower, casting long shadows across the sleek office floors. The buzz of activity echoed through the corridors, meetings, calls, the distant hum of printers. But at the top floor, behind a door of frosted glass, Lucien Vale sat in silence, staring at a financial report he hadn't processed in over 10 minutes. A knock broke through. "Come in," he said, voice flat. Renner Doyle stepped in, clipboard in hand. Always poised, always precise, Renner had been Lucien's executive secretary for 5 years. She'd seen empires rise and rivals fall. She'd also seen her employer's slow spiral from invincible mogul to something frayed and uncertain. Today, however, her demeanor wasn't just professional. It was laced with hesitation. "There's something I thought you should know," she said, carefully choosing her words. She approached his desk and placed the clipboard down. Though this wasn't about documents, Lucien didn't look up. "If it's about the Langford merger, move it to next quarter." "It's not that." Renner took a breath. "I saw someone today, at the boutique on Lyle and Crescent." Still distracted, Lucien barely blinked. "And?" "It was Zariah." Her voice softened. That name, like a bullet to glass, shattered the room's calm. Lucien's eyes snapped up. The pen slipped from his hand. "She looked different," Renner continued. "Brighter, healthier, happier." Lucien's chest tightened. He hadn't heard her name in years, hadn't dared let it echo in his mind. Now it rang like a bell. A deep ache stirred, unfamiliar and ancient. "She was holding a child," Renner added gently. "A baby boy." His world shifted. The air felt thinner. "A child?" She nodded slowly. 6, maybe 7 months old. Light brown skin, curls. "And," she paused, a tremble in her voice. "His eyes, sir. They were grey." Silence. Lucien stared at her, as if time had frozen. "Grey?" "Just like yours," Renner said, barely above a whisper. "Exactly like yours." Lucien rose from his chair, unable to remain still. He paced to the window, hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Outside, the skyline glittered, but nothing felt real anymore. "She never told me," he murmured, mostly to himself. "She never." His voice cracked. Renner said nothing. She had never seen this man, this Titan, look so shaken. For years he had moved like a machine, calculating and sharp. But now he looked hollowed, human. "Are you certain?" he asked, voice suddenly hoarse. It could have been someone else. "I spoke to her," Renner said softly. "Briefly. She didn't see me, not fully. But when I saw the boy, I knew." Lucien turned from the window, his expression unreadable, but his hands trembling. "He's mine." She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He sank back into his chair. The weight of it hit like 1,000 bricks. A son. A child. All this time, while he was trying and failing to build a family with Celeste, while his cold palace echoed with emptiness, Zariah had been carrying his legacy in silence. "I need to find her," he said at last. "Where was the boutique?" Renner hesitated. "Sir, I don't think she wants to be found. The way she held him, the way she looked. It was peace. It was freedom." Lucien's jaw tightened. "I don't care what she wants." But even as he said it, guilt flickered in his chest. He did care. Not out of pride, not out of entitlement, but because he had never truly seen her, and now he might never get the chance again. "She protected him from me," he said quietly. "She didn't trust me to love him." Renner nodded. "Would you have, back then?" The question sank deep. He had no answer. Lucien stood again, this time slower, more deliberate. "I need to see him. I need to know." Renner gave a small nod and slid a folded receipt onto the desk. "This is from the shop. It's the only clue I have." As she turned to leave, she paused by the door. "Sir, I've worked for you a long time, and I've never said this before, but maybe, for once, don't go in as the CEO." Lucien looked up, startled. "Go as a man. Go as a father." And with that, she closed the door behind her. Lucien sat there for a long time, the boutique name burning in his mind. Outside, the sky was beginning to shift, clouds crawling in like a storm on the horizon. He wasn't sure what he'd say. He wasn't sure she'd even listen. But for the first time in years, Lucien Vale felt something more than guilt, more than sorrow. He felt the beginnings of redemption. Lucien Vale wasn't a man used to waiting, or not knowing. From the moment Renner left his office, a storm took root in him. His empire, his fortune, even the haunting silence of Celeste's side of the bed, all of it faded into background noise. There was now only one obsession. Kyle, his son. The one he didn't know existed. The one he may have already lost. Within an hour, he'd made the call. To Ethan Garrison, his most discreet and trusted private investigator. Ethan had worked for Lucien before, tracking down embezzling partners and leaking executives. But never something like this. "I need everything," Lucien ordered, pacing across the living room of his penthouse that night. "Where she's been. Where she lives now. Who's in her life. I need a photo, a name, a child's birth certificate. Anything." Ethan, calm as ever, just nodded. "You're asking me to trace a woman who doesn't want to be found, with no official trail linking a child to you. This'll take time." "I'll pay you double," Lucien snapped. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "It's not about money, Lucien. It's about what you want when you find her." Lucien didn't answer. Because the truth was, he didn't know. Days blurred into each other. Lucien couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. His empire ran on autopilot. He ignored calls from Celeste, skipped meetings, and dismissed news about a stock crash that once would have enraged him. Instead, He sat in Kyle's would-be nursery, still untouched, and stared at the mobile of silver stars. Memories haunted him now. Zariah in silk on their wedding night, her eyes cautious but hopeful, her soft voice asking about children someday. The tremble in her hands the day he signed the divorce papers and walked away without ever really looking back. He had called her a pawn. Now she had something he didn't. A legacy. A soul. A son. Ethan's search took him through whispers and shadows. He found Zariah's last known address from 3 years ago. A walk-up apartment in Brooklyn. A neighbor remembered her vaguely. Sweet girl. Always smiled. Pregnant at the time, I think. There were no hospital records under her name. She'd used an alias, likely. No registered paternity for the child. Smart. She didn't want to be found. Every move she made was deliberate. But even the best ghosts leave footprints. Then one night, Lucien's phone rang. It was Ethan. "I've got something." Lucien sat up, his heart slamming. "Talk." "I found a preschool registry from a private daycare. There's a Zid Monette listed as an emergency contact, and a KLM enrolled under her profile. No father listed." Lucien's breath caught. "Photo. I'm sending it now." His phone buzzed again. One image. Lucien's eyes locked on it. There he was. A boy, maybe 6 or 7 months old, sitting in a plastic swing, chubby legs dangling. The curls were Zariah's, the skin warm and sun-kissed, but the eyes grey, stormy. His eyes. Lucien staggered back into his chair. The breath he'd been holding shattered from his lungs. Kyle, his son. No longer a possibility. No longer a question. A truth. A fact. A living, breathing part of him. And he wasn't there. He had missed the first cry, the first steps, the first laugh. Missed Zariah's swollen belly, her quiet strength, the hospital room, the sleepless nights. He had thrown her away, and in doing so, had thrown away all of this. A knot of grief, guilt, and longing twisted deep in his chest. Lucien poured a drink, the amber liquid trembling in his glass. But he didn't touch it. Instead, he stared out across the city skyline, gripping the photo. He didn't know how to fix this, didn't know if he could. But he would find Zariah. He would see his son, even if she hated him, even if he had to drop his pride, burn his empire, and walk through fire. Because that boy, Cale, wasn't just his blood. He was Lucien's only chance at redemption. It was a still afternoon in Belridge Park, a tucked-away stretch of green fenced by oak trees and whispers, the kind of place that existed between two worlds, quiet enough to be forgotten by the city's madness, soft enough to cradle secrets. Lucien stood at the edge of the park, heart pounding harder than it ever had before a board meeting or billion-dollar deal. The photo Ethan had given him had led him here. And now he stood frozen, a man gilded in guilt and disbelief, watching a scene that should have belonged to him all along. There she was. Zariah, sitting on a checkered blanket beneath a birch tree, hair gathered in a loose bun, sun slipping across her smooth cheekbones. Her laugh was light, musical, as she held a babyish above her, tossing him gently and kissing his round belly with exaggerated joy. And the child, Kyle. He was real. He was right there, alive, giggling, flailing his arms, his tiny mouth curling in that exact crooked way Lucien saw in his own photos as a boy. The sound of his laugh, Lucien's laugh, hit him like a punch to the chest. He stood there, stunned, watching the life he was never supposed to have. For a second, he couldn't breathe. Zariah saw him before he could speak. Her smile died slowly, like a flame snuffed by wind. She rose to her feet, calm, composed, even as she shielded Cale with a protective hand at his back. Her spine straightened. Lucien took a slow step forward, then another, until he stood just a few feet from her. "Zoraya," he said, voice ragged. She didn't reply. Her eyes, so dark, so deep, never left his. He looked down at the baby, who stared up at him with innocent curiosity, one dimple showing as he sucked on his tiny fist. Lucien's lips parted. His voice came barely above a whisper. "Is he mine?" Zoraya didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't waver. Instead, she lifted her chin and said with quiet fire, "You threw us both away." Lucien swallowed the lump in his throat. "I didn't know." "No," she said. "You didn't want to know." Her voice was steel now, but it didn't tremble. She looked down at Cale briefly, brushing his curls, then back at Lucien. "You signed those divorce papers like you were handing back an old contract. You left me without a word. 10 days later, I found out I was carrying him. And I knew I wouldn't let you stain him with the coldness you gave me." Lucien stepped closer. "I was cruel. I see that now. I thought I was doing what I had to." "To protect your image?" she cut in. "To chase your perfect white fairy tale with Celeste?" Lucien winced at her name. He shook his head. "That's over. It ended the moment I found out she couldn't have children." Zoraya laughed, but it was sharp and bitter. "So I was a duty. She was your fantasy. And now Cale is your redemption." "No," Lucien said quickly. "Numberat, I didn't come here to claim him like a trophy. I came because I needed to see him, to see you, to know if there's still a chance to be anything in his life." Kyle let out a high, sudden squeal, reaching toward a butterfly that fluttered nearby. Zoraya knelt down again, holding him close. She looked older now, not tired, stronger, more rooted, like a tree that had weathered storms alone and bloomed anyway. "I raised him in love," she said softly. "He has everything he needs. He doesn't cry at night for a father he's never met. I made sure of that." Lucien sank to a bench nearby, dropping his head into his hands. "God, Zoraya, I didn't know how empty I was until I saw him, until I saw you. I see now what I lost." She turned, looking at him, not with hatred, but with something more dangerous. Clarity. "You lost a woman who begged to be seen," she said, "and a child who smiled just like you. You didn't even look back." "I'm looking now," Lucien whispered. Zoraya stood, lifting Cale into her arms. "And it's too late to erase what you did." She paused. "Let the moment breathe. But maybe," she said, "it's not too late to start again, if you prove you've changed. Not to me. To him." Lucien looked up, eyes misted, hope quietly flickering behind guilt. "I will. I promise I will." Kyle reached his tiny hand toward Lucien then. Curious, open. Zoraya didn't stop him. Lucien stood slowly, heart thundering, and extended a finger. Kyle grabbed it, and Lucien felt it. That small grip breaking years of silence. It was the first thread of something new, something fragile, something worth everything. Lucien Vale had faced courtrooms, crisis boards, and hostile media storms, but nothing could prepare him for the quiet, unwavering wall that was Zoraya Monet. After that first meeting in the park, something in Lucien shifted. The sterile world he had carefully curated, the cold penthouse, the glass-walled office, the parties full of perfect smiles, now felt like a tomb. A tomb he had sealed himself in, brick by brick, when he'd let Zoraya go. Now he wanted to claw his way out. But redemption had no shortcuts, and Zoraya, she wasn't interested in words. He sent gifts, a carved wooden crib from France, hand-sewn baby clothes from Milan, a custom stroller with gold detailing. They were returned, unopened. He tried handwritten letters, sincere, raw. Lines like, "I failed you before I even knew how to be a man," and "Kyle deserves better than the shadow of who I used to be." No reply. One day, he stood outside her apartment with a bouquet of soft pink tulips, the kind she once said reminded her of home. Zariah opened the door halfway, baby Kyle on her hip, eyes guarded. "I don't need flowers," she said. "I need a man who doesn't run when things get hard." She shut the door. Lucien's frustration turned into desperation. He contacted a lawyer. "I want to know my rights," he said tightly. "I'm his biological father." The lawyer reviewed the sparse evidence. "You may have rights, Mr. Vale, but if you pursue this, it'll get ugly. The court will ask why you were absent, why she never listed your name, why the mother has full physical custody. It won't look good." Lucien sat back, ashamed. "She didn't tell me." "Because you weren't a safe place," the lawyer replied bluntly. "Fix that first." For the first time in Lucien's life, power meant nothing. He could buy an island, change legislation, but he couldn't force a woman to believe he had changed. So he started doing what he never had before. He listened, he remembered, he relived. At night, the flashbacks came. Zariah, in a white lace dress on their wedding night, standing alone on the balcony while he took calls from investors. Zariah asking softly if they could talk after dinner. Him brushing her off with, "I'm tired." Zariah, trembling the day he told her he wanted a divorce. "There's nothing here for me," he had said, coldly. "Let's not pretend this was love." Zariah, silent, eyes swollen, yet still dignified. And he, the man who once thought silence meant submission, now understood it had been grief. He began to change, not for the image, not even for Zariah, but for Cale. He started with small things, volunteering anonymously at a local youth shelter, cancelling parties, stepping back from speaking engagements, giving up the corner suite for a smaller, quieter office. He called Renna one morning. "Sell the secondary house in Miami," he said. "Donate the proceeds to single mothers' scholarships." She paused. "Are you sure?" "Yes. I've spent enough of my life collecting things I never needed." Then came the bookstore visits. Every Tuesday afternoon, Lucien stood outside the same children's bookstore where Zariah often brought Kyle. He never approached, just waited until they were inside, then left. Sometimes, through the glass, he saw Kyle pulling at books with bright covers, laughing. Other times, he caught Zariah smiling gently as she read to him, her voice lifting with each line. Lucien lived for those glimpses. One rainy afternoon, as Zariah bundled Kyle into his jacket, she caught sight of Lucien across the street. She didn't wave, but she didn't turn away either. Progress in inches. A month later, Zariah arrived home to find something strange at her door. Not a gift, not flowers, a single folder. Inside, a notarized document stating Lucien had set up a trust fund in Kyle's name. No strings, no visitation claims, just security. Zariah stared at it for a long time. He was still trying, still becoming. Not because he wanted her back, but because he finally understood what it meant to be a father. Late that night, Lucien stood on his balcony, eyes searching the city lights. He no longer dreamed of boardrooms. He dreamed of a toddler's laugh, of bedtime stories, of building blocks and sticky fingers. Regret clung to him, heavy, but no longer paralyzing. Because in that regret was something new, purpose, and hope. It was a Sunday, warm, golden, and quiet. the kind of day that whispered calm into the bones. Zariah had brought Cale to Mayfair Gardens, a quiet stretch of green they both loved. Butterflies drifted lazily above flower beds. Kyle toddled happily a few steps ahead, chasing the little blue wings in his usual lopsided, giggling stride. Zariah watched him from a distance, her eyes full but careful. She had become an expert in watching, measuring distance, calculating risk, knowing when to let Cale wander, and when to call him back. She didn't know Lucian was there. He had started visiting the gardens quietly on weekends, not to push his presence, but to watch his son from afar. Just glimpses. He had promised Zariah weeks ago that he wouldn't interfere, and he kept his word. But every moment spent watching Cale was oxygen to the man Lucian was becoming. He leaned against the farthest tree now, half hidden, his breath slow. Cale was wearing a little navy jacket, hood flopping as he ran. Zariah looked radiant in the light, curls loose around her shoulders. And then it happened. So fast. Kyle saw something, perhaps another butterfly, perhaps a leaf blown onto the street, and he took off, giggling. But his tiny feet didn't know danger. He wandered beyond the stone path, across the grassy edge, and right toward the road. Zariah turned and froze. "Cale!" she shouted, bolting. At that exact moment, a black SUV rounded the corner. Time collapsed into panic. Lucien saw it all in an instant. Kyle's chubby legs just steps from the curb, the SUV accelerating, Zariah too far behind. He didn't think. He ran. Faster than instinct, faster than doubt. Lucien flew across the lawn, lungs screaming, eyes locked on his son. Just before the car could reach him, Lucien dove, his arms wrapped around Cale, shielding him, rolling across the sidewalk with a thud, just as brakes screeched behind them. Silence. Then Cale's stunned cry. Lucien clutched him, holding the boy tight against his chest, heart hammering. "You're okay. You're okay," he murmured. His voice broke. "You're okay." Zariah reached them seconds later, her face pale with terror, arms shaking as she scooped Cale into her chest. "Baby! My baby!" Her voice cracked as she kissed his face, holding him so tightly he squealed. Lucien stood, brushing dust off his sleeves, dazed. The SUV driver was shouting something in the distance, but Lucian couldn't hear it. All he saw was Zariah. Tears streaming down her face, arms wrapped around Cale. Then her eyes rose to meet his. There was something unspoken there, something raw and real. And Lucien, he dropped to his knees, right there on the gravel-strewn path, in front of the woman he had broken and the child he had lost. No suit, no pride, no power, just a man laid bare. "I was a coward," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know what love was. I thought it looked like image, perfection, whiteness. But it didn't. It never did." Zariah held Cale tighter, watching him, tears dripping onto his soft hair. Lucien's hands trembled. "You gave me everything, and I threw it away. I didn't just fail you, I failed him before I even met him. But I swear to you, Zariah, I'm not that man anymore. I don't want to take him from you. I just want to earn the right to be in his world." Zariah said nothing for a long moment. The air hung still. Then Cale reached out, his small hand tugging at Lucien's collar, eyes wide. Lucien blinked, caught off guard. He let out a laugh through tears, a soft, almost broken sound. Zariah finally stepped closer. "You didn't save him today," she whispered. "You started saving yourself." Lucien looked up, stunned. Zariah wiped her eyes. "Don't waste this, Lucian. If you really want to be in his life, you show up. Not just today. Always." "I will," he said, rising slowly, eyes locked on hers. "Every single day." Zariah looked down at Cale, who gave a happy babble and patted her cheek. Then, softly, almost without thinking, she said, "Would you like to walk us home?" Lucien's breath caught, and then he nodded. Not as a millionaire, not as the man he had once been, but as a father. Spring came quietly, its breeze warmer than it had felt in years. In the weeks that followed the park incident, Lucien Vale did not vanish. He didn't send grand gestures or ring her doorbell with rehearsed speeches. He simply showed up. Each week, on Sundays, he arrived at the modest little apartment complex where Zariah and Kyle lived. He brought patience, not pressure, toys for Kyle, not diamonds, stories from his day, not apologies from his past. Zariah was cautious at first. Old wounds didn't close overnight. She watched closely, studied the sincerity in his hands as he changed Kyle's diapers with a clumsy tenderness, how he listened when she spoke about work, how he read Cale bedtime stories with a voice that sometimes cracked mid-sentence. Lucien didn't ask for forgiveness anymore. He earned it. One day, Cale was stacking blocks on the floor when he looked up at Lucien and said, soft but sure, "Papa?" Lucien's breath caught. The world seemed to freeze. He knelt slowly, placing his hands on the rug beside Cale. "Say that again, buddy." Kyle grinned, babbling nonsense with glee. But the word had landed, and it echoed in Lucien's chest, louder than any boardroom cheer or victory speech he'd ever known. He was a father. Fully. Completely. Undeniably. Zariah watched it all with a quiet ache in her chest. It was Cale's joy that softened her, not Lucien's words, not even his pain. It was the way Cale lit up when Lucien entered the room, the unforced laughter, the gentle games, the bedtime routines shared. She hadn't expected to love Lucien again. In truth, she didn't plan to. Her heart had been cracked too many times. But something strange happened when she stopped expecting him to fail. She started seeing the man he was becoming. One who admitted weakness. One who prioritized bedtime over business dinners. One who carried Cale's favorite blanket everywhere, just in case. And more than once, Zariah caught herself smiling when he wasn't looking. The day was calm, bright, and kissed by wind when Lucien invited them for a lakeside picnic. Zariah hesitated, still wary, but Cale clapped and squealed with excitement. So she packed a basket of fruit, juice boxes, and sandwiches, and they drove out to a quiet lake just beyond the city, where trees swayed like dancers, and the water mirrored the sun. Lucien had brought a large checkered blanket, a kite Cale adored, and 2 folding chairs he awkwardly fumbled to set up, earning a teasing smile from Zariah that warmed him more than the sunlight. They ate, laughed, played. Kyle splashed near the water's edge, while Lucien kept a safe watch, the 2 of them throwing pebbles and naming each one after a cartoon character. As the sun lowered, painting the sky in amber and gold, Zariah sat quietly beneath a tree. Lucien joined her, brushing stray grass from her hair. They didn't speak at first, until he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. He looked down at their fingers, then met her eyes. "I lost you once," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Never again." Zariah's heart squeezed. She studied the face that once caused her pain, now humbled, weathered, and honest. She let out a slow breath, laying her head gently against his shoulder. "Don't make promises," she murmured, "unless you're ready to keep them." Lucien kissed her forehead. "I'll keep this. One. Forever." As dusk wrapped the world in violet shades, Cale fell asleep in Lucien's arms, warm and safe. Zariah looked on. This was no fairy tale. There were no crowns, no perfect castles, but there was love, hard-earned, weathered, real, and sometimes that was the happiest ending of all.